Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Johan Verbeke. I'm the Director General of the EGMONT Institute, and I would like to welcome all of you for what is definitely going to be a very interesting evening. We have an extremely interesting partner with us tonight, Foreign Affairs, who doesn't know the Foreign Affairs, and we'll be testing the grounds as regards the current transatlantic relationship, the role of Nato, the European Union-US relationship. As you know, many of us qualify these times of disorder and turbulence. Many people speak about strategic unease, transition, uncertainty and unpredictability seem to be the key concepts you hear in all places. In short, we live in a world in flux. And that's going to be a little bit the topic of what we are going to discuss tonight, focusing, however, particularly on the transatlantic relationship, the place of the United States in that relationship. We live in a new environment, an environment in which the rules-based system is being questioned increasingly openly. We live in a world where NATO, whose relevance at some time around the 90s was being questioned, today definitely is rediscovering its own relevance again, but that also implies that all the partners, including the European partners, should be fully committed, and that is, of course, the burden-sharing question. Then there is the US leadership question, which is questionable, if I may say, and all this and other questions will be treated tonight in an open discussion, informal, not too much formal statements, and that kind of things. Let me briefly introduce our friends from the Foreign Affairs community, together with some Belgian friends. The friends from the Foreign Affairs community, I mean the community, the American side who is with us. I will start with Elizabeth Brow, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, more specifically at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Very much welcome, Elizabeth, to be with us here tonight. We have, and I shift to a Belgian colleague of the Egmont Institute, Professor Sven Bisschop, who is our director of the program Europe in the World, and who generally treats and covers the kind of strategic issues we'll be discussing tonight. To my right, we have the editor of Foreign Affairs, Gideon Rose. You can't have a more prominent representative of Foreign Affairs than Gideon. Gideon, very much welcome. Welcome to Brussels. Welcome to the Egmont Palace, and welcome to this evening tonight together with us, the Egmont people. And then to my left, we have the ambassador, permanent representative to NATO, good friend of all of us, who has been the chief of staff of the Minister of Foreign Affairs before taking up his job as the permanent representative to NATO. So these are the people who will be speaking on substance. I will be moderating a little bit the debate, and then basically we will have a kind of three-step walk through the evening. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation. After that kind of introductory presentation, there will be a short discussion among the panelists. And after that, the third step then is, of course, you. You are our guests of honor tonight, so that we can have a good interaction with all of you. So again, welcome. And now I would ask our colleague and friend Romuald Aschiora to say a few words on foreign affairs. And after that, Gideon, you will also say, I think, a few words.
Thank you. Good evening. Is it well? Yes. Thank you. In few words, everybody knows Foreign Affairs, the magazine, probably the #1 international affair review in the world. But till now, Foreign Affairs was not physically present in Europe. And the idea came up last year to organize a tour of Foreign Affairs in Europe. And I'm very proud to have been a part of this project as a co-sponsor, co-organizer. So Foreign Affairs had the first event last week in Germany, in Berlin, in London. Yesterday we were at IRIS in Paris, and tonight with you. And we hope that this series of events will be the opportunity to develop some partnership, and why not to some other event next year and in the future. I will leave Gideon to speak about Foreign Affairs. I think he will be better than me. And as you know, Gideon is the editor of Foreign Affairs, but also an author, and as we say in French, a real intellectual in the city. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm glad that was in French, because I wouldn't say it in English. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs. It's an honor and privilege to be here with you all. Foreign Affairs was founded a century ago when the American delegation, essentially the staff of the American delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference, realized that their colleagues back home didn't really appreciate the fact that the United States was living in an ever more globalized world and needed to actually have a foreign policy worthy of its power and position. And so they came back, and instead of disbanding, they founded a group called the Council on Foreign Relations. They founded a think tank to staff it called the Studies Department of the Council, and they founded a magazine, Foreign Affairs, to promote sort of public discussion of subjects essentially affecting American foreign policy and national security and diplomacy and world affairs, what was going on in the world and how the United States should best respond. Over the intervening century, we've essentially continued that exact same mission and essentially see ourselves today as soldiers in a broader campaign for the Enlightenment. We are devoted to the application of reason to public policy. We do things not just in security, but also in economics and society and broad, anything affecting the public sphere. We also do things not just in the United States, but the world at large. And we decided that it was high time that we took ourselves to where the subject matter was and our coverage was and our authors pool was, and broadened and globalized our operations. So with this tour, I can actually honestly say, if it's Wednesday, it must be Belgium, because we have been going on a series of tours and events, and the goal is to promote the sort of practical discourse that the liberal international order that has produced so many goods for so many but is now under attack desperately needs if it is going to both stave off the attacks which it is currently subject to and re-establish and renovate itself as a legitimate and beneficial path to success for all groups in society, in all societies, which its founders intended it to be, which it could be, but which is not necessarily perceived as being. So with that broader project in mind, we turn to this actual practical discussion.
Perfect. Well, Elizabeth, it's your turn.
Thank you for having me. My name is Elizabeth Braw. Thank you very much for inviting me for Foreign Affairs and EGMONT Institute. This is a fantastic project that I look forward to following up on as it scores success in various cities here in Europe and beyond. Now, I come from a transatlantic family, and the other day my daughter had to renew one of her passports, her U.S. passport, and we went to the American embassy, and the consular officers are very nice to children. They do a little interview with them, asking them who their parents are and what date they were born and so forth, and they also ask where they were born, and so the kind consular officer asked her in which country she was born, to which she responded, California. So with that in mind, that's just to illustrate the breadth of the United States and how it goes far beyond whoever happens to be in the White House. And that brings me to Galileo, who, as you remember, in 1633 said his famous words at his trial, "And yet it moves." And we have, whichever verb you want to put here, completed, endured the first year of Donald Trump's presidency. And I don't need to remind anybody in this room of the anxiety that we Europeans and transatlanticists felt as he took the oath of office, and before and after, and still feel. But I would submit that this first year hasn't been as bad as we feared. And if I can bring in Galileo again, and yet the transatlantic relationship moves. And it moves despite these undeniable political tensions, thanks to treaties, of course. But it moves, I would submit, largely thanks to the nearly 3 million men and women who serve in our armed forces in NATO countries and their allies, the allied countries. And those forces serve in many cases and many times in allied member states, together with soldiers from other allied countries. And I was looking at Italy, and when I was looking up its figures or its statistics on soldiers on international deployments, it was 6,500, which was up from 6,100 last year. But in the meantime, as of today, it's 7,000. Now, of those 7,000, around 1,000 are in Afghanistan as part of Operation Resolute Support. And there are nearly 3,000 Italian troops in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, including on NATO's operations Active Fence and Sea Guardian. There are 162 Italian soldiers serving as part of EFP in Latvia, serving under a Canadian commander, I might add. An Italian general commands NATO's mission in Kosovo, where he has soldiers from no less than 28 countries under his command. And the US, I should mention, has around 63,000 troops permanently stationed in Europe, and as you all know, additional ones on rotation, on heel-to-toe rotation. And that number is, of course, much lower than it was during the Cold War, when in Germany alone the US had 250,000 soldiers at its peak. But the point that I want to make is that these troops serving together and in increasingly multinational arrangements are the engine of the transatlantic relationship and the transatlantic partnership. And after they go on from the military, in the case that they do leave the military, either before retirement or when retiring at retirement age, they remain extremely committed to the transatlantic partnership. And I would venture that they are, in fact, our most committed transatlanticists, and they are a resource. And I'm sure you all have had conversations with officers who have served as part of NATO in various countries, and I can't remember the number of conversations I've had with such officers who have said, when I was a captain in Germany. And that's just something they take for granted. That's what an ally does for another ally. And so that makes NATO into, just as a byproduct, an Erasmus program, a transatlantic Erasmus program, where that cultural immersion is a completely free benefit that comes on top of these soldiers providing security for all of our countries and the NATO member states and their partners. And in fact, Ben Hodges, who, as you know, just retired from commanding U.S. Army Europe, is now dedicating his time to strengthening the transatlantic relationship. And if I could also add that these very soldiers, who may or may not come from a country near us, know a great deal more about our continent than most of us do ourselves, including the state and location of bridges, railheads, and country roads. And that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is, apart from Trump himself, the discussion that is very much dominating the current agenda about EU expanding its capabilities and whether that competes with NATO, especially as the EU tries to develop PESCO. And there is also the fact that a number of European countries have been dragging and are still dragging their feet when it comes to readiness levels, which essentially means they are banking on the US to help them in a time of crisis or war. And looking towards the future, I don't think there's a single European policymaker who's not aware that we have to address these problems, such as defense spending, which is, I think, mentioned in every single newspaper, at least weekly, and I think in German newspapers many times a day. But to my mind, the readiness is more important, because if we're not at a level of readiness where we can deter adversaries, we are not, the defense spending doesn't matter. One last thing that is important and should be a focus for our future transatlantic efforts is innovation. Now, part of PESCO is, as you all know, an initiative to provide R&D funding to EU defense companies. And the US, meanwhile, is, Gideon may talk about this, in the midst of the third offset. And I would love to see innovation cooperation or a joint innovation efforts between the EU or Europe and the US. Now, of course, our defense companies compete with one another, but we are all allies against our adversaries, who, specifically Russia and China, who have been making and are still making enormous strides in technology innovation for the armed forces. So to come back to our guys and men and women on the ground, they are making, they're doing tremendous transatlantic work. Now, we just have to make sure that they have the right equipment and the right rules and regulations to minimize the time wasted as they cross our continent. And if I may bring in the great Galileo again, with the right equipment and the right readiness levels and military mobility issues worked out, our troops would really be moving. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this strong introductory statement. We now move to the Belgian side. Sven Bisschop, who is professor at Ghent University and, in the first place, a senior fellow and indeed director of the Europe in the World program at EGMONT. Sven, you have the floor.
Thank you, Johan. Well, translated in English, my family name means bishop, so let me be the one of the church that says to Galileo, perhaps it doesn't turn, actually. And I guess for the sake of the debate, that would be fun. Yes, we have quite a few troops deployed together, and I think we in Europe should be very happy that the United States is supporting us through NATO with the pre-positioning of forces along our eastern borders, because we should be very honest with ourselves. If the US were not a member of it, the credibility of NATO's Article 5 would not be quite what it is. But this deployment addresses one problem, the issue of Russia. At the very same time, though, we see that the US is very unhelpful on quite a few other problems. The US has not caused all of these problems, and that we're sometimes, we should be a bit careful, because Donald Trump, in all his exotic tweets, sometimes creates the impression that the US is the problem. But more and more we find that the United States is not exactly helping to solve problems either, which is the role that traditionally we expected from the United States. And the US might actually create some new problems. Very specifically, if the United States would undo the nuclear arrangement with Iran, then our ways will part there. Because everybody in Europe knows that we need the nuclear arrangement with Iran, or we will never be able to stabilize this region. So the situation is not as rosy and not as unidimensional, I would say. The current US view of itself, the way the US stands in the world, worries me, because it's a view that seems to say we've been had, we've been cheated, not just by our enemies and our rivals, but even by our friends, and we have to rectify that. It's a view that's quite inward-looking. There's a disinvestment in multilateral structures, and there's a view that basically the world is a place where one competes. And competition means zero-sum games. You compete against someone, and therefore you need to invest even more in an already enormous military budget. If this is the way that the US looks at the world, I get worried, because if you look at the world like this, you begin to see the world as a very dangerous place, and you create a certain path dependency. Whereas I think in Europe we still see the world as a complex place, but not necessarily a dangerous one. And I think we see our role not in preparing for war. We see our role in creating stability in order to prevent war. All of this means that I think in the current context, Europe has to really get the strategic autonomy that it said in the 2016 global strategy that it wanted, meaning that we set our own objectives in view of our own interests, and that we pursue those working with the partners that suit our interests. That obviously means investing on our side, continuing to invest in a transatlantic alliance, but I think it also means complementing that alliance with partnerships with others with whom we can further our interests. And if on a given issue we are closer to China than to the United States, I think of climate change, we should not hesitate to then work on that issue with China. I think in a mature alliance, this should be flexible, that at times we agree to disagree, and that we also on the European side sometimes say to our North American allies, we also have some red lines, that if you cross them, well, then our cooperation on that topic will end there. A very important part of that is indeed stepping up our defense effort, which is exactly why we need the EU and why the EU needs to make a success of permanent structured cooperation. I think I can put my my view on that very simply. The EU or PESCO will save NATO because it's the only way the Europeans will get significant additional military capability. It's as simple as that. If every European country would start spending, as of tomorrow, 2% of its GDP on defense, we would still be dependent on the Americans, because the kind of equipment that we are lacking is of such a scale, of such a nature and quality, no single European country will acquire it on its own. Europeans can meet these capability targets only collectively, which is why we need to pool and integrate our defense efforts. That requires a structure, and that structure is ready-made. It's there, permanent structured cooperation. It's entirely logical that we do this in the EU because it's a European problem that we have to solve among Europeans, right? We're not gonna merge the Belgian Navy with the US Navy. No, we're merging it with the Dutch Navy. So that makes sense. But everything what we do through PESCO immediately reinforces the alliance. The only thing that we need to, I think, get out of our minds is that NATO only works with individual allies. We know what NATO as a whole wants to be able to do, and then it says to each and every individual country, this is your part of it. The problem is the European countries individually can no longer do their part. They can only do so collectively. So we need to introduce in between the level of NATO as a whole and the individual allies, the collective level of European allies and partners who, Pace Cyprus, happen to make up the European Union. So we have to create through PESCO a full spectrum, comprehensive force package that allows us, on the one hand, to pull our weight in NATO collective defense, that also allows us to be a part of expeditionary operations with non-European allies, but that at the same time allows us, when necessary, to act completely alone and to project military power alone, certainly in our periphery, in pursuit of our own interests. If I can end by just using an image to illustrate this. Think of these Russian dolls. Perhaps it's not the right moment to use this image, but I didn't find a better one. Think of all these Russian dolls, one inside the other. The NATO doll is, of course, for the moment quite big. It's a sturdy thing, right? But you open it, and there's only one tiny little doll inside, which is the EU. And you blow, and it's gone. What PESCO does is just to make sure that we get a bigger doll, that if you open and you take it out of it, that doll also is sturdy enough and can stand upright by itself. That does not in any way detract from NATO. It just makes NATO less hollow. That's what PESCO is there to do.
Thank you very much, Sven. That was a forceful statement as well. And we'll discuss some of the issues you raised because you kind of invited us to do that. But Gideon, you first.
So about 20 years ago, when I was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, I got pressed into visiting European parliamentary delegation to talk about ESDI. I wasn't an expert on European security. I was a more general American foreign and security expert, so I quickly cribbed up on my friend Phil Gordon's work and stole his notes. And I basically sort of talked to this group as a newcomer. And I said, look, I'm just a little curious about something. I'm all in favor, and I buy the idea of an independent capacity that's organized and integrated and able to have autonomous operations. That makes perfect sense to accomplish a mission if there's a mission that would be inappropriately done just by the Europeans alone. So tell me, I'm curious, what is the mission that's supposed to back up the ESDI organization and separate defense policy, right? So that do you want to get Bosnia? Are you going to take over Bosnia? Are you going to do something future in the Balkans so the U.S. gets out? So this is the capacity for that. Furious, buzzing. No, 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 you can't get out that easily. You're tied there. Your Americans are locked in. We're not doing anything without you because you want to get rid of European security. Not wait. Everything is joint. And I said, okay, fine. I'm not an isolationist. I don't want to give up the European plank of our operations. I'm all in favor of this. But we already have this thing that's supposed to be for joint military operations. It's called NATO. So what the hell do you need this other thing called ESDI for? When you come up with an option for that, we can discuss it. And until then, this was apparently the kind of thing that the little boy points out with the emperor with nobody else saying it, and it caused a big flurry. It didn't seem controversial to me. This is the kind of thing we would discuss and have been discussing at NATO-related conferences and transatlantic conferences for the last 20 years. It hopefully will be the kind of thing we will be discussing at EGMONT NATO-related conferences for the next 20 years as well. But as we say in New York, Manashtana halayla hazeh. Why is this night different from all other nights? And the answer is this conference is different from all other NATO and transatlantic troubled alliance conferences because it is taking place in this particular bizarre era. So let me use the little rest of my time to very quickly talk about the bizarre part of the operation, and everybody else can do the normal NATO transatlantic future troubled alliance concept. So there's a rather large elephant in the room, a big political elephant in the room, i.e. the Republican president of the United States, who you can't really have a conversation about the current state of the transatlantic alliance without starting with the president. However, you also can't end with the president because what we are currently seeing in the United States, and I'll just say this very bluntly, is this totally bizarre anomaly in which an otherwise relatively stable set of institutions internally and externally, which were sort of essentially built for defense against external attack, have been sort of penetrated by enemies inside, and essentially people who don't necessarily believe in the purposes of the government and the foreign policy and the structural institutions of American politics and government are now leading things. That's a very strange situation because the whole entire rest of the government is continuing to go on course, and there are political constituencies in the broader public that have various views on things. So this means that practically speaking, you have to analyze the current situation, look at things in American foreign policy right now on three levels. There's the president himself, the singular person who is Donald Trump with his background experiences, attitudes, approaches, communications. There's the president. There is the Trump administration, which is the combination of the president, his officials, and the American state apparatus below them, all of which are like a giant cruise ship or ocean liner that's very hard to turn, in which we all know the institutional roots deep inside. And there's the political, domestic political situation in which many of these foreign policy issues are now domestic political issues, or at least seen that way in the American domestic political spectrum. And so the preferences and attitudes of certain sectors of the public are given a huge amount of weight, whether or not they necessarily understand the details of the actual policy issues involved. What this means, right, is essentially that U.S. foreign policy has sort of like gone out to lunch for the moment because the different competing trends are canceling each other out. I was at a panel about during the transition when I was saying, my God, what's going to happen? How is this going to go? Where are all the different things going to go? Because none of us knew anything. And still don't. We're all watching, just like you guys. Nobody knows anything. We're all watching and trying to interpret history in real time as it plays out. But Corey Shockey, Republican policy wonk, said, and I said, what's going to happen? She said, you know what? All the messages and problems are going to cancel out, and there's going to be stasis, because no one's going to know who to go to, no one's going to know what policies are going to go through, and the result is going to be nothing's going to get done. And I thought about it, and I thought, gee, that's actually probably true. And I think by and large, that's sort of what is happening in most areas, certainly on foreign policy. Essentially, the model I would use, the model I would use is, there have been known to be times in the American political foreign policy history when a political appointee ambassador has been appointed with more resources than policy experience, shall we say, and the challenge of the embassy staff becomes from the DCM down to protect the bilateral interests of both parties and the equities of the relationship from the rather inexperienced political appointee at the top of the pyramid, who nevertheless has to have his or her prerogatives carefully managed. And I would say that that basically is the situation in the United States today, with the president being the ambassador, the political appointee at the top who has his views and attitudes and his position and authority, and the entire state apparatus who is like the embassy staff. And I would suggest that basically, as far as the transatlantic discussion goes, with that basic model in line, you do exactly what you would do in that ambassadorial situation, and you work with the staff, you flatter the ambassador, and hope that the not too much damage to the relationships are caused during the tenure until something resembling normalcy returns down the line, when the normal political planets bring themselves back into alignment. And at that time, there are all sorts of really interesting practical discussions about the European and American roles in NATO and operations out of theater, and what ways we can respond to new and contemporaneous threats like cyber, and how you counter Russia's new hybrid warfare and so forth. But until this presidency is at least sort of substantially different or over, the United States, unfortunately, at least at the highest levels of policy, will be sort of absent both from those discussions and from most of the implementation. That's the unfortunate message that I have to bring from somebody who's watching the foreign policy stuff play out in the U.S.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Gideon. Again, stuff for thought. And now, François, you have the last word.
Thank you, Chair. From the onset, I would like to state that Belgian ambassadors are career diplomats. We are not political appointees. Nobody flatters me in my delegation. My deputy, who happens to sit here among the public, is a very clever guy, but we talk among professionals. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to be to make any sensational effect, and certainly don't want to be ideological, but I would like to tell you that at NATO there is no Trump effect. There is no Trump effect, simply. We may have been shocked by a difference in style. That's true. We may have been surprised by a difference, I would say, in the manner whereby multilateral discussions are conducted in the presence of the American president. It's also true. And I fully understand that indeed the situation must be difficult for many Americans and many partners of the Americans worldwide. But at NATO, we have none of this problem. Why? During the campaign, there was this famous word, obsolete, that was used by the then candidate, Donald Trump. And immediately after he came to power, luckily enough, though we were pretty nervous in these days at NATO, immediately followed him a Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, a man who knows NATO very well, a man who knows the European Union and Europe, a man who knows what the transatlantic link means in terms of security and defense. And thanks God, Trump listens to Mattis. Then came also another person, another official, Rex Tillerson, whose obviously communication with the president might not be that easy than in the case of Jim Mattis, but he's still there. I mean, people claim that Rex Tillerson is about to leave. I have read that sort of news for more than 10 months. He's still there, and he still advises the president in the very right way concerning the transatlantic link. And you have a third one, H. McMaster, as National Security Advisor, who definitely also belongs to the same stable of the people who know Europe, who know NATO, and who know the value of this transatlantic link. Every of the themes that are presently under discussion, and where indeed it is true, President Trump claims he is the first one to have initiated, and where he believes he pioneers, every of these topics are for many years on the table of NATO. Let us take the example of burden sharing, a one that is indeed extremely important for the sustainability of NATO, for the viability of the relationship between Europeans and Americans. But burden sharing is a claim that dates back to President Kennedy. And systematically, every following presidents have rightly claimed the Europeans to do more to protect their own continent. And I think this is a very legitimate request from the Americans. When you look at the situation today, even taking into account that the US is a large power, not a global power, not to be compared to the various either Canada or European individual countries, even taking that into account, you realize that it is by far too much unbalanced. When you have a relationship of 80 to 20, or in the best case 75 to 25, it cannot stand. It was maybe possible in the time of the Cold War, where we all lived under the terror, and where the Americans indeed played the absolute dominant role. But this is no longer the case. The European Union exists, has developed considerably, and takes gradually more responsibilities in terms of defense and security. So we have, like my distinguished neighbor Sven Biskup said, it's quite normal. We have to take more responsibilities in terms of operations, in terms of capabilities, and in terms, obviously, of interinstitutional cooperation. That is for this team. The other team, where President Trump claims he's the first to have shaken NATO, is counterterrorism. But NATO is engaged in counterterrorism since we launched the ISAF mission to Afghanistan, almost more than 20 years ago. One of the first mandates of ISAF was to make sure that Afghanistan would no longer be a safe haven for terrorism. Now, we may argue about the success of this mission in Afghanistan, but nonetheless, the objective of anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, was there. There is absolutely nothing new that has brought about by the new American president on the scene. I recognize, though, that his general aversion for multilateralism is a problem. It's not a problem for NATO, because all of this is well organized within the framework of a treaty that is easy to read, not a monster. The Treaty of Washington is very easy to read and organizes the existence of NATO in a very good way. But the problem is indeed when you go outside and you talk about security, world security in other places than the transatlantic. When you talk, for instance, about the JCPOA in Iran, yes, there we have a problem with global security and the new American president. I would say that for this cooperation between EU and NATO, that we see really taking off these last years, and more particularly since the declaration of Warsaw, things are doing pretty well, certainly when we compare to what existed before, or rather what didn't exist before. Before the declaration of Warsaw, there were plenty of big statements, rather empty, pompous but rather empty. Now we have really substantial matters to discuss. We mean business, operationally and capability-wise. I will never claim that everything is rosy and quite okay for the work, and certainly not in terms of capabilities. That's where we will probably have the biggest difficulties. But nonetheless, it is on the table. with proposals. We worked that out, and it works pretty well. Sven earlier said to you that CSDP will save NATO. I would say that the reversal is also true. There won't be any serious and credible CSDP without NATO, and more particularly the presence of the Americans. That's this, on this sentence I would like to end up my presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francois. I would now suggest that we have a short discussion among ourselves, and then in about 10 minutes we give the floor to our audience. I would first like to ask a question to our American friends, and then another question to the Belgian friends. But as far as the American friends are concerned, what is the perception right now? You kind of made a history about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and you were quite fair. We agree with that reading of history. And until a few years ago, indeed, most of our pretenses, that is, we will increase our efforts towards the NATO budget, our commitments and readiness and so on. We said a lot, there were a lot of words, but not so much real acts. And the criticism coming from Washington was a fair one, although I like to remind that at a certain stage in the 90s, for instance, you were quite reluctant at having the Europeans really getting their own military apparatus and security apparatus ready. You kind of preferred that you had the say in NATO and that we just were kind of keen followers. But today things are changing. Sven referred to the grand strategy of 2016 of Mr. Mogherini. Let's say that even within Brussels area, not everybody seems to be convinced that this is really going a breakthrough grand strategy, but there it is. Sven also mentioned PESCO as a new vehicle that may render European capabilities and readinesses and so on in a more sharp focus. What is the perception in Washington? Do you pay attention to those developments, or are you still on the slightly skeptical line that we still have a credibility gap to walk?
So I can't speak for the American, I can't speak for the American government, certainly, or even really for the deep policy establishment on these issues, because I follow them the way a general foreign policy person would and the American editor would, rather than like the European policy wonk. But given that perspective, actually, it's useful to a group like this, because one of the things that I can hear, one of the things the Trump era has been useful for has been cutting to the chase and cutting through all the things and the rhetoric and getting to core essentials. Who's your enemy? Who's your friend? Who will put up with what? Who will go along with what? And the battle lines are pretty clear. And it's interesting because it's not what one would have expected. We've had battle lines on policy and partisan stuff. And now we're having battle lines on who actually will be prepared to say that 2 + 2 = 4 as opposed to 5 or 3 or whatever is said this day. And somebody who will say it's 5 or 6 or 3 is somebody you literally can't trust as part of an honest discussion, because they'll now say anything. And people suddenly you thought were a serious person, now you know are no longer serious. So there's only people. By the same token, people who care about policy and care about cooperation and working with each other for collective benefit. That's the dividing line. It's not the specific institution. It's not the theoretical preference for multilateralism or unilateralism when you can, or plurilateralism or coalitions of the willing. It's, do you even believe in a positive-sum world in which mutual gains can be had for common benefit among like-minded people who believe in, and countries who believe in essentially a liberal vision of liberal economies, liberal societies, democratic political systems, and ever more inclusive societies and markets globally. And anybody who believes in that is on the same team, and anybody who doesn't believe on that is the opposing team. And the specific discussions here that you're having so much seem couched in the old political and institutional forms. The EU and NATO, that's absolutely crucial, obviously. But what's now clear is the EU and NATO are component parts of a much broader liberal order. And that's what we now can see. It's the true liberals, not in any immediate political sense, but people who believe in individual liberty and ordered liberty, who believe in democratic politics and private markets but used for public benefit in a broader way in some kind of mixed economy, and peaceful international relations that cooperate for mutual benefit on multilateral issues that are a common thing. All the people who believe in that, in whatever particular institutional capacity they happen to get together or work, are allies, and any kind of institutional lag or friction or squabbling among those institutions is dead weight loss bureaucratically inside the order against the enemies, because the enemies are out there and they're growing in strength, and they have allies inside who are fifth columnists. And so the biggest thing I would bring to this, as someone who's outside of this, is understand the threat and band together and figure out ways to solve the usual bureaucratic BS within inside the discussions of the multilateral community and all these various things, for ways to pool our common efforts against the real enemies. The last thing I would say is NATO particularly is going to have a very interesting challenge. And I was just talking to Celeste Wallander about this and hoping that she'll write about it in a future issue of the magazine, which is, we used to be a pure security organization, and we said they were political, but realistically we tolerated all sorts of stuff like, you know, in Greece and in Turkey and elsewhere, right? And we put liberal politics back in the back burner during the Cold War years. Then when the Cold War receded and the security threats essentially receded to the back burner, we focused more on values and the NATO as the sort of arm of a broader European project and liberal project. But that basically privileged all sorts of liberal things. Now we see two things going in opposite directions, because now we see the security stuff coming back. My God, it's even the Russians again. But we also still are attracted to those liberal goals. And so what do you do with Eastern Europe when you see backsliding domestically on the principles that we now have come to think of as the core of NATO as well as the other stuff, but you still need them for security things? Or Turkey. That's going to be an interesting question. We haven't had to do that. We're going to go back to the questions of what do you do with when colonels take over a country? Do you still keep everything going just fine? We thought we were out of that business in NATO, but those are the discussions we're going to be having in years to come. How much do you need the country that's now run by some colonel that violates all the principles you think you hold dear because of the broader struggle that actually is really ongoing? I'll just leave you with that question.
Well, that was quite a clear answer. Elizabeth, would you like to elaborate on that before asking our Belgian friends to react?
I'm not sure I can elaborate on Gideon's point because it was so good, but one aspect that you mentioned that is very important is that we have to pool our efforts against the enemy. And so there is a lot of institutional fetishism going on where, oh, is it this or that institution, which letter combination is it again, and who is competing with whom? But really, when it comes to security, it's all the same soldiers in this case. It doesn't really matter under which letter combination they happen to serve. Yeah. And we have essentially outsourced security. We treat it like having meals delivered to our door. And so in the area of expeditionary warfare, that was okay because it wasn't really a great effort. It was difficult enough as it was, but a few delivery guys can handle a few delivery orders, and a few soldiers can also handle an expeditionary war. But now, with the security situation changing, we're squabbling over the brand of the pizza that we are having delivered to our door, instead of saying, actually, we all have to get involved, and we citizens have to get involved in informing ourselves, because we have to pool our efforts against the common enemy.
Perfect. Well, that was a good start. I turn to the Belgian side. I think you are overlooking one point, that is that Europe is not just one single country and that there are a lot of arbitrages going on among us. But Sven, would you first react and then François?
I think I was going to say exactly what you said, Johan. It's from the US, you can say this is institutional fetishism because you're the US and it's a country that's the size of a continent, and that's exactly the point. Well, the course of world politics today is determined by countries the size of a continent or by a group of countries that groups together to acquire that scale, the size of a continent. So for us, the Europeans, the only option to do that is the EU. We will be an actor as EU or we will not be an actor. So this is not an EU versus NATO debate. The EU is an actor, NATO is an instrument. It's not about that. It's an EU versus national states debate. And unfortunately, we will have evidence very soon, very likely very soon, of my point. Because the moment the United Kingdom leaves the EU, they are no longer a part of this institutional fetish. They will realize that their foreign policy role is finished. There will be no marge de manœuvre to have any impact whatsoever on the big issues in world politics. If Europeans want to be an actor rather than just a subject of international politics, there is only one choice, and this has to group together. And then the question is to play what role? I don't think we Europeans are thinking in terms of we are banding together against the enemy. I don't think that's how we see the world. I think we are trying to band together and play a constructive role in the world and try to see with whom else can we build a stable world order again. Hopefully with the United States. And I know on the one there's not much we can do, so yeah, we have to sit it out, the Trump administration. 4 years is a very long time. You can do a lot of damage in 4 years if you really want to. And I'm not convinced this will just be an interludium. I mean, I use the word interludium because there are indeed some comical aspects to it sometimes. But what if a Trumpist is the successor to Trump? What if another Trump is the successor to Trump? He does seem to be putting his daughter in pole position. What do we do then? I am even, François, not always so encouraged by the forces of stability, the generals around Trump, because of course they are less impulsive. But when you read what someone like James Mattis says, he also seems to think that Iran is the source of all evil in the Middle East. So on some issues of substance, they're actually on the same line, which is a different line from all of us. So I'm not saying this all to be a negativist, and again, I'm not saying this to somehow plead that we need to take our distance from the US or from NATO. I'm saying that to a European audience, the only way we're going to play a role is collectively, and there is only one forum that has the potential to allow us to play that role, and that is by really making something of the EU.
Thank you, Chair. A few remarks. I would tend to disagree about the comeback of the political nature of NATO. In the 50s, you had the Three Wise Men report, which put forward, for the first time in the history of the alliance, its political character. And in 1967, somebody we are very proud of, then Minister of Foreign Affairs from Belgium, Pierre Armel, basically was at the basis of a new doctrine for NATO in which the political role of the alliance was emphasized. And it played a crucial role in the development of NATO. Up till today, where we have realized very much how important was that contribution by Pierre Armel. So that's the first point. I mean, NATO, from the onset, was a political military alliance. Indeed, the first years of the Cold War saw a predominant role for everything that was related to the military, but already in the 50s it changed, it shifted, definitely at the end of the 60s, and today we are, I would say, even more when we consider the South and the way we treat the possible threats emanating from the South, we are before all a political alliance. I believe that because of the world environment, security environment, that is complex and fast changing, we have no other options between Europeans and Americans than to stay together to confront security challenges. It is an absolute necessity because the kind of message we used to send to third countries about our societal values, which is after all the fundamental of security. That is to say, democracy, human rights, basic freedoms. When you look 20 years ago, this was a message that sort of passed more or less. Today, we have enormous difficulties to try to convince third parties about the validity of this message. And there is only one part of the world where the same values are existing and prevalent, that is North America. I don't say that we have always the same interest than the Americans. I don't say that we have the same perception of the world as the Americans, but we definitely have the same values than the Americans. And because of that, decoupling or weakening the transatlantic link on security would be a very serious mistake. Do you believe that the Chinese listen to Europeans unless they have a strict interest? No. Do you believe that the Indians, when they will have achieved their full potential, will listen to the Europeans? unless they have a strict commercial or economic interest? No, they don't. They politely listen to us, and politely they send us to hell. Very politely, but they do it. Our only way of preserving our security, of preserving our society values, are the Americans, the North Americans, US and Canada. And definitely we should put an accent on this necessity. Finally, I would disagree a bit with my dear friend Sven. We do not perceive from the EU side the world as where is the enemy to tackle. Well, this is very typical of the EU, because we are kind of naive and we are very much showing angelism there. The world is tough, extremely tough, and there is no reason why dictators would listen to kind words. They listen to power relationship, period. That is the reason why at the EU, if we want to be credible on defense and security, we should take the basis of what was initiated very recently by the Council and the Commission, PESCO indeed, the funds, in order to really try to build something a bit credible in terms of defense and security. What we have seen these last year is maybe interesting to see indeed, but there is nothing there in the CSDP missions that is really credible in terms of defense. And even when it is credible, when we go, as Americans say, to the kinetics, that is to say to real war, even in this circumstance, it's one country, for instance France, confronting terrorism in Mali or in Sahel region, and 10 kilometers behind the other EU powers, playing the role of logistical support and force protection and so on. The real test will come when you have on the front line different EU countries, and not only one. And that is the advantage of NATO, and that is the reason why I believe NATO is indispensable, because when we have a NATO operation, we are together with the Americans. Of course, our size is much more limited, but we are together with the Americans on the front line. Thank you.
All right. And briefly, all of you, give a very short reaction on the following. You seem to say, with Galileo Galilei, eppure torno. Things are basically what they were. Things go ahead. Don't worry too much. Incidentally, it is the same community that was so much exaggerating and dramatizing just a few months ago that is now telling us, where did you get that dramatization? Keep calm. Things are basically all in the right direction. Now, my question is still, Trump is there. I agree with your position. Basically, I don't think this will change basically a lot as far as foreign policy is concerned. The United States balance, institution, checks and balances, what have you. But still, there is something new in terms of leadership, world leadership, I mean. And that was already, in part, the case with Obama, who also already withdrew to a large extent, I would say. So there is a leadership question. Hence, there is a question of influence. Does the US still have an impact on world developments as much as it had in the past? And three, there is something like the intangibles, that is the moral standing of the United States, which I think has been damaged, a kind of reputational damage. I just referred to a couple of statistics that came out recently, but when the question is asked all over the world, it's a worldwide poll, in what entity, and the choice was among Russia, China, US, and the European Union, do you have most confidence and trust? Europe stood out remarkably high, and the United States stood at the bottom. When the question was asked, in what power do you believe? What real power is a power that you think is a power at large? Germany, for instance, came out very strongly. So something is happening in terms of leadership, influence, and therefore diplomacy, because diplomacy is essentially leadership. How would you respond on that? And perhaps also you very briefly make a statement about, does Trump really not change that much, notwithstanding the uncertainty, the unpredictability, and that kind of things?
So this is deeply humiliating to have to say, but I agree with all the questions that you raised. We all debate those same things ourselves. You can see our coverage of them in Foreign Affairs, where we try to bring together the rational, knowledgeable voices from across the political spectrum to debate just these kinds of questions. The one that I'm particularly, as a political scientist, most interested in right now are two things. Or one particularly is the if you no longer have presidential communications being credible, because we all just dismiss the tweets, then what do you do with an entire system of deterrence and assurances based on credibility of commitments if you're saying, oh, we all know, we just ignore these commitments but not other? That we haven't played out. We've been studying that. And so, you know, the great academic question of what credibility actually matters and what consists of is going to be answered pretty soon, because no one trusts the statements of the President of the United States anymore, and yet our entire alliance system is based on commitments. That'll be interesting to watch play out. But the broader question, look, we have a stress test going on right now between an anti-institutionalist placed at the top of a dense network of institutions. And the question is, will the institutional cage restrain the anti-institutionalist inside, or will the chains be broken and the bars be broken and the whole structure be, you know, introduced by the current occupant, whether domestically or internationally? And we don't know. We're watching that play out. So think of this as a stress test of U.S. domestic political institutions and the liberal order more generally. And the last thing I'll say about that is, you know, when I hear sometimes the voices, the extreme versions, not of Sven, but of the kinds of arguments that Sven has been making. Sometimes when I hear those kinds of arguments, from an American perspective, it seems to me that Europeans sometimes, or some Europeans rather, have transferred their loyalties from one national sovereign structure to a higher regional sovereign structure without stopping as part of a larger question to say, wait a second, isn't the point here to get beyond simple mere sovereign structures which are all or nothing, and to have a sort of alliance of alliances, a partnership of partnerships, a collective broader network of loyalties and allegiances of people who believe in cooperative behavior and mutual beneficial activity at home and abroad. And I think that from that perspective, the question is not sort of should the EU be an actor, but how all the good people, and that means the good people here and the good people abroad, it's not just countries or regions, it's the individuals and institutions and political communities that are prepared to play by the rules that are commonly agreed upon and live by them and change them according to standard patterns, and the ones who aren't. That's the basic one. It's the rule-based liberal international order, and all the various institutions we're part of are connected to it, and the questions of where things bleed off on the side and what major actors have side deals here and there is true, but wars are great wars, are won by alliances. They're not won by individuals. World War II, for God's sakes, was won with the Russians and the Stalin as a key partner of the liberal democracies because we had an even greater and more urgent common threat. Right? We have a basic common threat. Now the world of Enlightenment, rationalism, and common cooperation, domestically and internationally, and rule-based, law-based systems are under attack. And there's no distinction between building and protecting, right? European history is filled with, you know, the notion of sort of the borderlands and the things beyond it and the ones inside. There's order inside the walls of the castle, and there's disorder in the marchlands and the places outside. Right? And so NATO's guarantee is we are the border, and we are defining the place for which we will fight. And you're right, it was always political, but it was military first because it was here is the boundary over which we will fight. And inside these walls, outsiders don't come. Inside these walls, we determine our own freedoms and in partnership together. And now we're expanding that community and building institutional networks, just like Sven talked about, for people to live and work together in communal patterns. And it's not just in the transatlantic community, and it's not just in Europe, and it's not just in North America. It's in Asia increasingly, it's in Africa and Latin America, in parts of China, certainly in parts of India. The entire globe is coming together. We were just talking about, yes, and the US right now is an idiotic player absenting itself. Okay, so we're walking away from Paris. But we're going to come back to Paris because what? We're going to believe that global climate change is not occurring? Of course it is, and Americans will come around to that as well. It's just a temporary bit of insanity, right? So when we come back, what's more significant? That China, whether they believe it or not, whether they're willing to or not, is picking up that baton and coming in as well, and everybody else is doing it. So you know what, Sven, you're absolutely right. It would be a disaster if the Iran deal was screwed up, right? And the best reason that it's not going to be is all the Europeans and all the other partners saying it would be a damn disaster, because the things you really have to worry about with this administration, which is not particularly competent and not particularly disciplined and having a long-term strategy, is the things they can do easily and quickly with executive power. That's why the deregulatory agenda is the one that's done the most progress so far, and tax cuts was the only thing that get passed because that was the one thing Republicans can agree on. So no long-term strategic policy changes are going to occur.
All right, perfect. Sven, a short reaction. Does Trump make a change? You said, and I fully agree with that, we don't live in an intrinsically more dangerous world than 10 years ago. Trump is not making that big a difference, but still, unpredictability, uncertainty, versatility. What is your opinion? And then we shift to the public at large.
To put things even more sharply maybe, since I'm having fun, I think in the future we need to move away from the idea of NATO as an alliance between the US and Canada and a bunch of individual European countries. The most logical thing to do would be to say you have an alliance between the US and Canada on the one hand and the EU on the other hand. Because that is a matter that levels, the level that matters for Europe. That would make sense. We do trade together, we have a currency, we have a foreign policy, we're trying now to build our defense together. It would only make sense that collectively we enter into an alliance with the US, rather than everybody separately. Of course, the alliance of the good people, and you don't need to put too much emphasis on these structures, sounds good if you're American, because then alliance of the good people is what we've had, and that's an alliance that the US dominates. That worked pretty well for us, right? I'm not complaining about us ever since 1949. That worked pretty well with us, but whereas an alliance between the US and Europe collectively would, of course, be an alliance which the Europeans would have quite a bit more influence on what it does. So that's my view of the future, but I have the feeling I can still write a couple of articles before that's realized.
So Trump, and that means that Trump is not awakening you at night. The public, who is asking for a question? Yes, please, can I ask to present you clearly who you are, what institution or affiliation you have?
Thank you very much. My name is Muhammad Rajai Barakat, and I would like to speak as a Euro-Arab citizen. My origins are from the Middle East. I agree with you, Mr. Ambassador Dukirkov, about all what you said about NATO. But when you speak about our values, and USA is the only, with Canada, are the only part with which we can have the same values. I remember 15 years ago in this room, when a former ambassador, USA ambassador to NATO, came here and he said to Europeans, we have our strategy to go in Iraq. If you follow us without discussion, you can have some contracts. And we followed USA, and you know now what had happened in Iraq. Also with Middle East, with President, I'm sorry, because with the Middle East, now Mr. Trump broke any hope for having peace in the Middle East. The two-state solution can never exist now. And with Iran, we have many doubts, and I think Mr. Bishop said that. Nobody can imagine what Mr. Trump is going to do. Before coming here, I received a small video, and in this video, there are all words that Mr. Trump said. I am the only one who can do this. I am the only one who can, I'm the only president who can do this and that. I can't understand your position,
Sorry,
Mr.
can you conclude,
Thank
please,
you very
because
much.
there are a lot.
Hi, Bart Shefchuk at the European Political Strategy Center and previously at the State Department's policy planning staff and the U.S. mission to the UN. Just want to echo a lot of what Gideon had said, especially about the point about status, and ask a question. whether there are any areas that you could imagine where you could have agreement at the ministerial, departmental level, given that there's been a lot of delegation of authority to the Pentagon, to the State Department and so forth. Are there any particular transatlantic areas of cooperation that you could envision that would not necessarily require a presidential decision? And question for Ambassador Kirkov, you mentioned that there's been basically no Trump effect on NATO, and the question is whether you think there's been any effect on the decision whether to have a new strategic concept at NATO. Thank you.
Thanks. I do, Jim Moran from the Center for European Policy Studies. I agree with much of what Gideon has said and others about the institutional framework in the United States. But sorry to hark back to the Middle East. I suspect that there is some serious damage being done and about to be done. The previous speaker did mention two of them. Jerusalem is one thing, and that's bad enough. But the one that really does concern me is Iran. And there's a great deal of talk at the moment, and this is extraordinary talk, but nevertheless you get it. This is an extraordinary time, bizarre time, as you said, about how to appease the president on Iran. And with that in mind, with the next 3 or 4 months ahead of us and the next certification round coming up, what do you think about that? Is it something you think that Europeans should be working for, to appease the president, or should we stand firm and resist any attempt to abrogate or modify the agreement, etc.?
Do you take up the Middle East questions on Iran and Israel-Palestina, and can you then take up the question which was addressed to you?
So very quick, by the way, to our European Arab friend, a lot of our countries have a lot of things to apologize for and have screwed up a lot of things in the past that may or may not be relevant to the contemporaneous debates, which have their own logic. So I don't disagree with a lot of what you said, but may not be relevant to the challenges of right now. With regard to the question about Trump and the Middle East and more generally, so I think that in terms of what kind of cooperation, it's an interesting question, and it's got me thinking. I would say if there are those conventions that the U.S. basically helped negotiate but then can't get passed in the Senate, like, like the ICC or something like that, where all the diplomatic apparatus is there and you have a delegation that's sort of involved in helping to write it but doesn't actually join, and so you work with those officials to keep them sort of involved so that if and when the political powers that be or the policy apparatus can be nudged in that direction, there'll be staff work for it. I would say work at that level, because the president is not particularly institutionally able or interested in controlling the bureaucracy. He just sort of wants to push it aside. And so flames that can be, coals that can be banked in various parts of the bureaucratic apparatus for ongoing cooperation when there's political will would be the way to go. With regard to the Middle East, I mean, what can I say? I was more scared with the Middle East a year ago than I am now. I was shocked by Jerusalem like everybody else was, and it was a purely domestic political thing. It has nothing to do with actual policy. We don't know what we're actually going to do in terms of the future of Middle East policy, because no one ever imagined you would do something this stupid, because we all know that it prejudices final status talks. So whoever the next president is, or the next State Department, which actually has a functioning State Department, will have to figure out what the hell their Middle East policy is. How do you either walk this back or come up with some other deal on the side or limit it with something in East Jerusalem? God knows what, but that's what's going to happen to walk this back. With regard to the two-state solution being over, I mean, come on, it's like the monarchy, right? The two-state solution is dead. Long live the two-state solution. There is no other solution. Neither side's going to kill each other. Neither side's going to live under a one-state solution. They're not going to be a permanent colony. There's going to be a two-state solution. The only question is how to get there and how long it takes and what the details are. And so this is yet another backward detour. It's going to take a long time to go forward. And just sort of what I'm worried about, frankly, less Iran than Korea. What keeps me up at night is Korea. From what I, by the way, I was actually not worried about Korea until a couple of weeks ago, because all the stuff in the summer was obviously sort of silly and nothing happened, and they appointed a good friend of mine who I trust completely, who's a deeply hawkish person but utterly sane, Victor Cha, and I said to him, Victor, okay, go out there and you have one job, it's to make sure we don't all blow up. If we all die in a nuclear war, I'm going to really hold you personally responsible and be totally pissed at you. And he said, I know, I get it. And then what happened, I was sort of calm. And then literally last week, he basically walks away from the job because he's like to warn everybody that these guys are a little bit crazy and they're actually thinking about striking Korea. And so if their own ambassadorial designate is saying this, that scares the crap out of me. And that's where my particular worries are this spring, which is Korea, not Iran. And partly because there's going to be a whole lot of European diplomatic pushback on the question of whether you should appease. No, everybody should functionally play different roles. Let the Japanese appease. Let the Saudis appease. The Europeans, you need to appease the vanity and ego, but hold firm on the policy.
All right, we keep that in our ear. François.
Thank you, Chairman. First, the issue that was addressed about the Middle East. Yes, I mean, we have diverging views between Europeans and Americans. I mean, when the Americans went to Vietnam, it wasn't the whole NATO, it was just the Americans. It hasn't made any effect of NATO. And when, at the time of when George Bush Jr. was a president in the Iraq case, many Europeans disagreed indeed on the initiative towards Iraq. It has created a lot of tensions across the transatlantic ocean, but it hasn't damaged the NATO either. I mean, we perfectly understand that with 29 democracies, it's impossible to think always in the same direction, but we have to reconcile through our consensus-building method. Should we appease the president? This is already, it has started already a long time ago. I mean, it's several weeks now that, at least from Europe, I mean, both the EU and different European Union member states like France, Germany, and the UK, explanation teams have been sent to Washington in order to appease and explain the president what is exactly the purpose of JCPOA and why it has to stay there, because it would be a much more dangerous situation if we didn't have it. But I mean, this is the exercise ongoing. There was another question, if I'm not wrong, about the strategic concept of NATO. I mean, this is ongoing debate at NATO for the time being, indeed. We have to realize that our strategic concept should stick to reality, and it is true that and there I disagree with what I've heard, the security environment has changed rather dramatically in the last 10 years. So we have probably to consider that. On the other hand, we should not haste in creating a new strategic concept. I mean, things have to be taken very carefully there in order to first have some added value in the new strategic concept and avoid divisions. This is extremely important for the alliance to keep unity. So the creation of a new strategic concept means that before all, we are all standing on the same principles, on the same basic principles of this strategic concept. So we will see. I do not rule out that during the Brussels summit in July, there would be some tasking decided by our political masters to prepare the ground for a new strategic concept, but it will certainly not be adopted on the occasion of the Brussels summit. And there, by the way, there is no real input from the American administration so far.
All right, we'll take a last round, 3 questions straight ahead in front of me. Yes, please.
Thank you. Robert van der Meulenbroek, former Belgian diplomat. I have a question on the renewal of the nuclear deterrent for the American panelists. This came up very early in Mr. Trump's presidency when he talked about $1 trillion cost for the renewal of the U.S. nuclear weaponry and carriers at the same time. Now, I'm puzzled by that because, as far as I know, there are about 9,000 nuclear weapons in the U.S., could be more, could be less, as many in Russia, and I wonder where the real threat is. According to me, there is no threat, but maybe you may see a threat. And for what reason has this been trumped up in the weeks ago and still now by the president? Is it to keep the arm industry happy and create thousands and thousands of jobs like the president is claiming? Or is there another reason? Is there a real reason necessary to do it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, there was a question here, yes?
Thank you. David Fouquet of the CERIS Graduate Studies program here at the 2 Brussels University. Actually, my question was along the similar line. We've had, in relatively rapid succession, a national security strategy, national defense strategy, and nuclear posture review. I just wonder, some of them are fairly fundamental and far-reaching, like my predecessor mentioned about nuclear issues and other issues. I just wonder from our American friends how comfortable they are with that, and from the European side, whether there was any consultation or whether it does perhaps cast a shadow over any kind of NATO strategic posture review.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Last question.
See if this works. Thank you very much. Ulrich Schmidt, also European Political Strategy Center, European Commission. Thank you very much for some interesting presentations today, and sorry for being two in the questions. I see I'm the last one, so maybe it's okay. I just want to insert one third narrative, maybe, on the European Defense Corporation, what's going on now, and tie that to a question. Because what I hear, at least, is a little more divisive here than what we see from the inside, where member states are very pragmatic about this. This is not a beauty contest with NATO. It's not a beauty contest with the United States. It's basically a pragmatic way to create more synergies and more money for defense capability development. That's going to be for the good of everyone, both for the United States, which will have a Europe which is more capable of doing the things we do together, and for the United States as well in having a Europe which is more operationally autonomous. Whether that's strategic autonomy or operational autonomy, it means the same thing. It means we're able to go to places we were not able to go by ourselves before. Why should we do that? Why should we not be able to do something ourselves in Libya or in other places, in Sahel today? That's just, you know, a rhetoric question. So getting over this whole beauty contest is just very, it's the core of it. And then I would love to tie that to a question. Looking at it in this perspective, do you see any particular opportunities for cooperation between EU and NATO? Maybe not in the coming year, maybe not in the summit declaration, but for the next 5 years. What's going to be the working relationship that we might build from this complementarity between the two organizations and the member states within? Thank you.
Perfect. I suggest, Guillaume, that
you, a very quick little thing on nuclear.
Elizabeth takes up the nuclear question, and that on our side, on the Belgian side, they take up the European defense beauty contest, which is not a beauty contest, and the NATO, European Union cooperation. A brief word on what they do in NATO as far as nuclear deterrence is concerned. Yes, please.
On the nuclear question and the administration, so to the question about what did he mean by when he said that about the nuclear deterrent, to go back to the analogy I used before, on questions dealing with policy of anything that's actually a sort of sophisticated policy question or a long-term policy question, talk to the embassy staff. Don't listen to the ambassador's statements, talk to the embassy staff about what the actual position of the USG is. On the nuclear question and on the various reports, there is a governmental bureaucracy that's still taking place in the United States. Not just NATO is unaffected, so large swaths of the American administrative state are unaffected and go forward and move forward. And they have to do things like issue conventionally mandated things, and the people at the White House have jobs that they have to do. And so they issue these reports. The question is, do they mean anything or not? And what I would say there is, it's actually funny, we're debating this ourselves. I was talking to a friend, a high-level experienced person about this the other day, and they said, before the national security strategy came out, because no one knew what it was going to be, And we said, I was saying, do you think it's going to be more important than usual? Because usually we don't give a shit about these things. And we said, is this going to be more important? Because now we don't know what they're going to say. And he said, nah, I think it's going to be even less important than usual because it'll be some compromise between things. And it turned out to be even that because essentially it's a bureaucratic compromise and you have the credibility question. There are whole passages that are inserted that are this and there are whole passages that are that. So what I would say is if you want to interpret the U.S. government's and administrative states' positions, look to the actions and officials in the state itself rather than the White House for the current time. And if you're looking about how deep the Trump effect will go in terms of these specific policies and things, look for the things that can be controlled or affected by unilateral action from the White House rather than broad cohesive policies over many years of different parts of the administration. Those things are going to remain the same.
Elizabeth?
I think we all remember Obama, and he said all the right things, and the US government just kept chugging along like it always does, thanks to these institutions that Gideon has highlighted before. And I think the same thing is happening now. Trump says all the wrong things, I think is most of our opinion, but the US government still keeps chugging along. And as for the nuclear weapons, I think my concern is, so Obama, by the way, started modernizing the nuclear arsenal. He just didn't make a big deal of it and also didn't brag about it. And I think my concern now is that the public will, it will alienate the public further, even though it may not be a hugely dramatic departure from Obama's policies. And so I wonder whether we'll see huge demonstrations against these new low-yield nuclear weapons in Germany, for example. And then to the gentleman who said something about the EU Defense Cooperation, was that? Yeah. I would like to, if I could come back to you in a year or two and see how well everybody is getting along with France, because isn't that the elephant in the room, France versus everybody else in European defense cooperation?
All right. First, briefly on the nuclear issue, and then Sven on the...
On the nuclear issue, yes, all NATO allies were consulted by the Americans during the process of writing the nuclear posture review. It took many months, but all of us, we were consulted, and more than one time. So we have to applaud the transparency of the American administration in that respect. They were extremely cooperative and very transparent. Now, let me tell you that this new US nuclear posture review, despite what the press may have emphasized, has before all an element of continuity. This is the main aspect. Of course, there are a few changes that were immediately singled out by the press and presented as if it was something totally new. Not at all. The element of continuity is predominant, and certainly with some decisions that were taken by previous President Obama. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll come later for the EU NATO.
I think on Europe, European defense, there's now actually a very strong joint leadership. It started out as a Franco-German initiative and then became Franco-German, Spanish, Italian. And I think certainly for now that is set to continue. So I don't think France is the element in the room of European defense. I think France and Germany are the two working horses, if you want another animal picture. And the best thing that we can now do for EU-NATO cooperation from a PESCO point of view is to make it clear that through these cooperative schemes, which by the way actually also include the very important Commission scheme, the European Defence Fund, that we can meet not just EU capability targets, but this is also the way to meet NATO capability targets that serve our collective territorial defense. I want to just add one more thing, because I have the same feeling as a couple of weeks ago when we had another event on American grand strategy in the age of Trump, and I do feel somewhat uncomfortable that we sort of impose self-flagellation on our American colleagues, and you know, every country has its moment. You have your Trump moment. We had our year and a half or so without any government, so we had our moment then. So in a way, that one you have to sit out. The only way in which I think we were a little bit smarter about it is that we shut down the government, but we kept the federal civil service running, so things keep working. You know, to keep the government but shut down the federal service. The next time I would suggest you to do it the other way around.
In 2 words about EU-NATO, there is no such question as a beauty contest. I mean, I don't know where you've seen that or heard that, but at NATO, I can tell you it is all about complementarity and coherence. Thank you.
We'll close this interesting debate. I would like, of course, to thank once again Elizabeth Brough for being with us, Gideon Rose for being with us, and of course also the colleagues of the Institute, Sven and Ambassador de Kerkhoven. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your active participation. I hope you go home with some new ideas. That's it. All right. Thank you very much. Well done. Good job.